Welcome to session 22 of our class on the Conquest. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 16. When David met Hushai, it was an answer to prayer. But when he met Ziba, the encounter met an immediate need, but created a problem that wasn't settled until David returned to the throne. Ziba had been one of Saul's land managers, as well as a custodian of Jonathan's crippled son, Mephibosheth. Knowing that Ziba was an opportunist with evil motives, David was suspicious about Ziba's presence, his gifts, and the absence of Mephibosheth, who had been cared for by David. Ziba had brought a group of donkeys for David and his family to use, as well as generous amounts of bread, drink, and fruit. The gifts were needed and appreciated, but David was concerned about the motive behind them. Ziba lied to the king and did his best to discredit his young master Mephibosheth. David was weary and deeply wounded within, and it wasn't the best time for him to be making character decisions. He accepted Ziba's story, which was later discredited, as we will see in chapter 19. And David made a rash judgment that gave Ziba the property that rightfully belonged to Mephibosheth. Proverbs 18:13 states, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." God's leaders must constantly be on guard, lest they make unwise decisions on the basis of incomplete information. And that goes not only for leaders, but for every person. Through Ziba's lies, Satan attacked David as a serpent who deceives. And then, through Shimei's words and stones, Satan came as a lion who devours. Ziba told lies, and Shimei threw stones, and both were making it hard for David. The king was now near Bahurim in the tribe of Benjamin, where the pro-Saul forces were still strong. Shimei was on the hillside opposite David and above him, and it was easy for him to throw stones and clumps of dirt at David and his people. David was exhausted and discouraged, and yet he never rose to greater heights than when he allowed Shimei to go on attacking him. Abishai was only too willing to cross over and kill the man who was attacking the king, but David would not allow it. Abishai had also wanted to kill Saul in the camp of Israel in 1 Samuel 26, and he assisted his brother Joab in murdering Abner in 2 Samuel 3. So David knew that his words were not to be treated lightly. Get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel," Shimei shouted, but David didn't retaliate. Shimei was blaming David for the death of Saul and his sons, for after all, David was officially in the Philistine army when they died. The fact that David was miles away from the battlefield when their deaths occurred didn't seem to matter to Shimei. This loyal Benjamite probably blamed David for the death of Saul's son Ishbosheth, who inherited Saul's throne, and also Abner, Saul's loyal commander, and of course Uriah the Hittite as well. "You have come to ruin because you are a man of blood," Shimei said. Shimei was breaking the law while giving vent to his hatred for David, because Exodus 22:28 says, "You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people." David's attitude was one of submission, because he accepted Shimei's abuse as from the hand of God. David had already announced that he would accept anything the Lord sent to him, and now he proved it. When David considered that he was an adulterer and a murderer who deserved to die, yet God let him live, why should he complain about some stones and dirt? And if Absalom, David's own son, was out to kill him, Why should a total stranger be punished for slandering the king and throwing things at him? David had faith that God would one day balance the books and take care of people like Absalom and Shimei. Perhaps David was thinking of Deuteronomy 32:35, where God said, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay." When David regained the throne, he pardoned Shimei, as we will see in chapter 19, and later Solomon restricted Shimei to Jerusalem where he could be watched. But when Shimei arrogantly overstepped his bounds, he was arrested and executed, as we will see in 1 Kings chapter 2. David and the people went beyond Bahurim, some 20 miles to the ford of the Jordan River, possibly near Gilgal or Jericho, and it is at this place that they rested. Very early the next morning they crossed the river and proceeded to Mahanaim, where at this place Jacob had prepared to meet his brother Esau and had wrestled with God in Genesis chapter 32. Maybe David remembered that event and gained courage as he thought of the army of angels that God sent to protect Jacob. Well, what did all this suffering accomplish for David? Well, the fact is, it made him more like Jesus Christ. He was rejected by his own people and betrayed by his own familiar friend. He gave up everything for the sake of the people and would have surrendered his own life to save his rebellious son who deserved to die. Like Jesus, David crossed the Kidron and went up Mount Olivet. He was falsely accused and shamefully treated, and yet he submitted to the sovereign will of God. Peter speaks of Jesus in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23, where he says, "Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously." As we have seen here, the same thing could be said of David. Well, David had lost his throne, but Jehovah God was still on his throne and would keep his promises with his servant David. Faithful to his covenant, the Lord remembered David and all the hardships that he had endured, as David says in Psalm 132, verse 1. And he remembers us today, his faithful servants. This brings us to 2 Samuel 16, verse 15. And we see David's bittersweet victory in this passage as it goes on through chapter 18 and verse 33. You know, when Douglas MacArthur, General of the United States Army, spoke before the United States Congress on April 19, 1951, he made the famous statement, "In war, there is no substitute for victory." But more than one military expert has maintained that armed forces can only win battles, and that in the long run, nobody really wins a war. Why? Because the price is too high. For every word in Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, 125 people died in World War II. In view of modern atomic weapons, nobody would win, quote unquote, World War III. David's army and Absalom's army were about to engage in battle in a civil war that neither father nor son could win, but both sides could lose. If David won, it meant the death of his son Absalom and his friend Ahithophel. If Absalom won, it could mean death for David and other members of his family. In modern terms, it was a catch-22 situation. Absalom was trusting his charm, his popularity, his army, and the wisdom of Ahithophel, but David was trusting the Lord. He said in Psalm 62, verses 1 and 2, "Hear my cry, O God, attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth I will cry to you. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I." Well, what was it that David experienced during those difficult days? First and foremost, David's throne was usurped. In 2 Samuel 16:15 through 23, the paragraph picks up the narrative that was interrupted at chapter 15 and verse 37. And it does so, that is, it was interrupted so we could learn about David's escape and his encounters with Ziba and Shimei. But thanks to David's speedy departure, Absalom's rebellion was a bloodless takeover, and he took Jerusalem unopposed, which was just what David wanted, as seen in chapter 15 and verse 14. Unlike Absalom, David was a man with a shepherd's heart, who thought first about the welfare of his people. In verses 16 through 19, Hushai won Absalom's confidence. As soon as possible, Hushai entered the king's audience chamber and officially presented himself to the new king. He didn't want Absalom to think he was a spy, although that's exactly what he was. He was God's man in Jerusalem to frustrate the counsel of Ahithophel. Absalom was no doubt surprised to see his father's counselor in Jerusalem, but his sarcastic greeting didn't upset Hushai, who spoke respectfully to the king. Hushai's words to Absalom must be read very carefully, or they will be misunderstood. Hushai gave the usual respectful greeting, "God save the king." But he didn't say, "God save King Absalom." In his heart, he was referring to King David, but the new king didn't understand what Hushai was saying. In his pride, Absalom thought Hushai was calling him the king. Again, note that Hushai doesn't mention Absalom's name or say that he will serve the new king. In verse 18, Hushai is speaking about David, for the Lord had never chosen Absalom to be Israel's king. And Hushai didn't promise to serve Absalom, but to serve in the presence of David's son. In other words, Hushai would be in the presence of Absalom, but he would be serving the Lord and David. A proud man, Absalom interpreted Hushai's words to apply to himself, and he accepted Hushai as another counselor. This decision was of the Lord and prepared the way for Absalom's defeat. In verses 20 through 23, we see that Absalom followed Ahithophel's counsel. Absalom had two important tasks to perform before he could rule the kingdom of Israel. The first was that he had to seize his father's throne and let it be known that he was officially the king. Unlike his father David, who sought the mind of the Lord or through the Urim and Thummim or from a prophet, Absalom looked to human experience and wisdom, and he looked at things from a human point of view. And you might say that from a human point of view, Ahithophel was among the very best. However, Ahithophel didn't seek the mind of the Lord, nor did he want the will of the Lord. His primary goal was to avenge himself against David for the sin that he had committed against his granddaughter Bathsheba and her husband Uriah the Hittite, as we have seen before. It was customary for a new king to inherit the previous king's wives and harem. So when Absalom followed Ahithophel's counsel, he was declaring that he was now king of Israel. By taking his father's concubines, Absalom was making himself totally repulsive to his father and breaking down every possible bridge for reconciliation. The new king was telling his followers that there was no turning back and the revolution would continue. But unwittingly, he was doing even more. He was fulfilling Nathan's prophecy that David's wives would be violated in public, as we saw in chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. David had been on the roof of his house when he lusted after Bathsheba, and that's where David's wives were violated. In chapter 17, verses 1 through 28, we find that David's prayer was answered. Having achieved his first purpose and taken over the royal authority, Absalom now had to deal with the second matter, and that was to make sure that David and his followers didn't return and take back the kingdom. The solution was simple but drastic. He had to find his father and kill him. For guidance, Absalom turned to his two counselors for help. Humanly speaking, if Absalom had followed Ahithophel's plan, David probably would have been killed and Absalom's problems solved. But David had prayed that God would turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness, and God used Hushai to do just that. Note that Ahithophel put himself front and center by using phrases like, "Let me now choose," "I will arise," "I will come," and so on. He wanted to be the general of the army because he wanted personally to supervise the murder of his enemy, King David. His plan was a good one. Use a small army that could move swiftly, attack suddenly at night, and have David's death as the one great goal. Ahithophel would then bring back David's followers, and they would swear loyalty to the new king. It would be a quick victory, and very little blood would be shed. Hushai wasn't in the room when Ahithophel outlined his plan, so Absalom called him in and told him what his favorite counselor had said. Directed by the Lord, Hushai took an entirely different approach and focused on the ego of the young king. Hushai's reply is not a series of "I will" statements about himself, but rather a series of statements about the new king that couldn't help but ignite Absalom's imagination and inflate his ego. Hushai laid an effective verbal trap, and Absalom fell into it. First, Hushai explained why Ahithophel's counsel wasn't wise at this time, although it had been wise at other times. As for focusing only on the murder of David, Absalom knew that his father was a great tactician and a mighty warrior, surrounded by experienced soldiers who feared nothing. All of them were angry because they'd been driven from their homes. They were like a bear robbed of her cubs. Furthermore, David was too smart to stay with the troops. He would hide in a safe place where he could not be trapped. His men would be on guard, and they would set ambushes and kill anybody who came near. David's army was too experienced in war to be unprepared for a sudden attack. A sudden attack by a small army wouldn't work. If the invading army were repulsed, word would spread that Absalom's forces had been defeated, and then all his men would flee. Absalom would then begin and end his reign with a military disaster. Then Hushai presented a plan that overcame all these difficulties. First, the new king himself must lead the army, and it must be the biggest army that he could assemble from Dan to Beersheba. This suggestion appealed to Absalom's inflated ego, and in his imagination he could see himself leading the army to a great victory. Of course, he was not a seasoned military man, but what difference did that make? What a way to begin his reign. Absalom didn't stop to consider that it would take time to gather his forces from Dan to Beersheba, time that David could use to cross the Jordan and hide in the wilderness. Hushai, of course, was interested in buying time for David, so he could do just that. With such a large army at his command, Absalom didn't have to depend on a difficult surprise attack, but could fall on David's men over a wide area, like the morning dew that falls on the ground. Wherever David's men fled, they would see Absalom's forces, and there would be no escape. Instead of sparing David's forces, Absalom's army would wipe them out, so they couldn't cause trouble in the future. Realizing that Absalom might be worried about the time element, Hushai answered his objections in verse 13. If during the delay in rounding up his troops, Absalom heard that David had taken his men into a walled city, the task would be even easier. The whole nation would obey their new king and work together, taking the city apart, stone by stone. Ahithophel's matter-of-fact speech was forgotten as Hushai's grand plan, punctuated with vivid mental pictures, gripped the hearts and minds of Absalom and his leaders. God had answered David's prayer and confused the counsel of Ahithophel. Absalom would ride at the front of his army, intent on victory, but he would meet with humiliating defeat. Psalm 33, verses 10 and 11 says, "The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the peoples to no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations." Well, we see in verses 15 through 22 that David's spy system worked. David and his people were camped at the crossings of the Jordan, about 20 miles from Jerusalem, and the two runners were waiting at En-Rogel in the Kidron Valley, less than a mile from Jerusalem. Hushai gave the message to the two priests and told them to tell David to cross over the Jordan as quickly as possible. He was not to delay. If Absalom changed his mind and adopted Ahithophel's plan, then all might be lost. Zadok and Abiathar told an anonymous maidservant. She took the message to Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who immediately ran a mile south to the house of a collaborator in Bahurim. However, a young man saw them leave and recognized the priest's sons. Wanting to impress the new king, he told Absalom what was happening, and Absalom's guards started out after the two young men. At this point, the account reads like the story of the two spies recorded in Joshua chapter 2. If you remember, Rahab hid the two spies under stalks of flax on the roof of her house. The wife in Bahurim hid the two runners in a cistern, a place where water was stored, covering the opening with a cloth, and she sprinkled grain on the cloth. The cloth would have looked like it was there to provide a place to dry grain in the sun. Not obligated to assist Absalom in his evil plans, the woman sent the guards off in the wrong direction, and the young men were saved. They arrived at David's camp, gave the king the facts, and urged him to cross the Jordan immediately, which he did. The guards returned to Jerusalem empty-handed, but Absalom didn't see their failure as a serious problem. How wrong he was. In verse 23, we see that Ahithophel took his own life. Why? Was it because Absalom hurt his feelings by rejecting his counsel? No. It was because he knew that Hushai's counsel would bring about Absalom's defeat, and Ahithophel was serving the wrong king. As a traitor against King David, Ahithophel would either be killed or banished forever from the kingdom. Rather than humiliate himself and his family in his death, he put his affairs in order and hanged himself. His suicide reminds us of what Judas did in Matthew 27 and verse 5. Ahithophel had been a faithful servant of the king and the kingdom until he determined in his heart to get vengeance on David for what he did to Bathsheba and Uriah. This desire for revenge so obsessed him that he ceased to be a servant of the Lord and began to serve his own sinful desires. He knew of Absalom's ambitions, but kept them hidden from David, and he cooperated with the crown prince in the palace takeover. But with all of his wisdom, Ahithophel was supporting the wrong king, and the Lord had to judge him. Both Ahithophel and Absalom ended up hanging from a tree. How tragic it is when a man or woman leads an exemplary and useful life and then fails dishonorably at the end. There are old fools as well as young fools, and Ahithophel was one of them. All of us need to pray that the Lord will help us to end well. In verses 24 through 29 of 1 Samuel 17, we find that friends cared for David. David and his party crossed the river and came to Machanaim, the former capital of the 10 tribes when Saul's son Ishbosheth was king. It was at Machanaim that Jacob saw the army of angels God had sent to protect him in Genesis 32. But David had no such vision. However, God often uses human angels to help his servants, and this time it was Shobai, Machir, and Barzillai. They brought provisions for the king and his people, and saw to it that they were adequately cared for. God prepared a table for David as his enemies were approaching. Psalm 23 and verse 5. Absalom's army was commanded by Amasa, who was David's nephew and Joab's cousin. Of course, Absalom was commander-in-chief. How sad that son was fighting against father, uncle against nephew, cousin against cousin, and citizen against citizen. War is bad enough, but a civil war makes it even worse. Absalom and his men crossed the Jordan, intending to meet David's army somewhere near the forest of Ephraim, about 3 miles northwest of Machanaim. The forest of Ephraim was probably named by some Ephraimites who crossed the river and settled on the western side in the region of Gilead. In chapter 18, verses 1 through 18, we find that David experiences the death of his son Absalom. Knowing that the enemy was soon to arrive, David numbered his troops, divided them into 3 companies, and placed Joab, Abishai, and Ittai as their commanders. Whatever approach Absalom and Amasa used, David's men would be able to maneuver and help each other. David offered to accompany the army, but the people told him to stay in a place of safety in the walled city. "There are 10,000 of us, but only one of you," they argued. They knew that Absalom's soldiers would go after the king and not worry about the soldiers. If David stayed in the city, he could send out reinforcements if they were needed. David accepted their decisions. He didn't want to fight his son anyway. But neither did he want the army to fight his son. Absalom had stood at the gate in Jerusalem and verbally attacked his father back in chapter 15. Now David stood at a city gate and instructed the soldiers to go easy on Absalom. Absalom certainly hadn't been gentle with his father. He had murdered Amnon, driven David out of Jerusalem, seized his throne, violated David's concubines, and now he was out to kill David. That doesn't sound like the kind of man you would want to protect. But if David had one fault, it was pampering his sons. But before we criticize David, we must remember that he was a man after God's own heart, even though he had imperfections. Let's be thankful that our Father in heaven hasn't dealt with us according to our sins. In His grace, He gives us what we don't deserve, and in His mercy, He does not give us what we do deserve. Jesus did not deserve to die because He was sinless, yet He took the punishment that belonged to us. What a Savior. The battle spread out across the area, and many soldiers died because of the density of the forest. We don't know how many men perished on each side, but it's likely that most of the 10,000 dead belonged to Absalom's army. Both the sword and the forest devoured their victims. But God didn't need a sword to stop the rebel Absalom. He simply used the branch of a tree. How much his heavy head of hair contributed to this accident is not recorded, but it's ironic that the thing he was so proud of, as we see back in chapter 14, 25, and 26, turned out to assist in his death. Indeed, pride does lead to judgment. Job 5 and verse 13 says, "He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the cunning comes quickly upon them." The soldiers who encountered Absalom hanging from the tree didn't dare touch him, but Joab had his own agenda. It was Joab who had orchestrated the reconciliation of David and Absalom, and now Joab ignored David's orders and killed the young man. Absalom rejected Ahithophel's plan to kill the king only, but Joab accepted it. There's a hint in verse 11 that Joab had quietly spread the word that he would reward any soldier who killed the rebellious son. The soldier who could have won the reward refused to kill Absalom for two reasons. He didn't want to disobey the king, and he wasn't sure Joab would defend him if the king found out about it. After all, David killed the man who said that he had killed Saul back in chapter 1, as well as the two men who killed Saul's son Ishbosheth back in chapter 4. The soldier knew that Joab didn't want to be caught issuing an order to kill the king's son when the king commanded otherwise. The death of Absalom marked the end of the war and the rebellion, so Joab withdrew his troops. Both Absalom and Ahithophel died on trees, and to an Israelite, hanging a body on a tree was evidence that the deceased was cursed by God. Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23. When you consider the crimes these two men committed, is it any wonder that they were cursed? Yet God in His grace forgave David of the same crimes and allowed him to live. At one time, Absalom was the most popular man in the kingdom, but he ended up being buried in a pit, his body covered with stones. Apparently, his 3 sons had died already, so there was no one left in his family to perpetuate his name. So he erected a pillar to keep his name alive. But even the original pillar is gone, and the so-called tomb of Absalom that is seen today in the Kidron Valley is from the days of the Herods. Proverbs 10 and verse 7 says, "The memory of the righteous is blessed, but the name of the wicked will rot." Well, in 2 Samuel 18, verses 19 through 33, we see that David's heart was broken. The war was over and the rebellion ended. All that remained was for Joab to notify the king and return him safely to Jerusalem. But it was a bittersweet victory for David. When the enemy is your own son, there can be no triumph and no celebration. Ahimaaz was a well-known runner, according to verse 27, and he volunteered to take the news to the king at Mahanaim, some 3 miles away. As enthusiastic as the young man was, he didn't realize what he was asking, because David was known to take out his anger and sorrow on the messengers. Although the word tidings that Ahimaaz used could apply to any kind of news, it usually referred to good news, and there was no good news that day. Joab knew his king very well, and he knew that the report of Absalom's death must be conveyed with compassion and skill. To keep Ahimaaz safe, Joab selected a person known only as the Cushite, who was possibly one of his own servants. Better that a foreign servant be killed than the son of a Jewish priest. However, after the Cushite left, Ahimaaz continued to annoy Joab and asked for permission to run. There was nothing good or bad to add to the news, so why run? Weary of hearing the young man's pleas, Joab gave him permission to go. Well, the scene shifts to Mahanaim, where David is seated between the outer and inner gates of the city, waiting for the watchman in the tower to give him word that a messenger is on his way from the battlefield. Even though he was unprepared to speak to the king, Ahimaaz put forth every effort and passed the Cushite on the road. David said, "He is a good man. He comes with good news," verse 27. It's obvious that the character of the messenger has nothing to do with the contents of the message, but it is possible that David was grasping for any straw of hope available. Before he arrived at the gate, Ahimaaz was so anxious to give the news that he called out, "All is well." Then he came to the king, bowed before him, and told him that Joab had won the battle. When David asked about Absalom, the young messenger was not prepared or equipped to share the bad news. So he made an excuse that was undoubtedly a lie. In his feeble attempt to go down in history as the man who brought the news from the forest of Ephraim to Mahanaim, Ahimaaz ended up having nothing to say that David wanted to hear. He ended up standing to one side and watching the Cushite deliver the right message in the right way. The text says that David trembled violently when he comprehended that Absalom had been killed. No doubt he had prayed that the worst would not happen, but it happened just the same. In one sense, David pronounced his own sentence when he said to Nathan in chapter 12 and verse 5, "And he shall restore the lamb fourfold," because this was the final payment of David's great debt. The baby had died, Tamar was raped, Amnon was slain, and now Absalom was dead. David tasted once again the pain of forgiven sin. David's tears reveal the broken heart of a loving father. Speaking about David's sorrow, Charles Spurgeon said, "It would be wise to sympathize as far as we can, than to sit in judgment upon a case which has never been our own." David wept when he heard about the death of Jonathan and Saul, when he heard about the murder of Abner, and when he heard about the murder of Amnon. So why shouldn't he weep over the death of his son Absalom? Once again, we see the heart of God revealed in the heart of David. For Christ died for us when we were sinners and living as the enemies of God, Romans 5, 7 through 10. David would have died for Absalom, but Jesus did die for us. David's problem wasn't that he grieved over his son, because grief is a very human response, and tears are a part of the healing. His problem was that he grieved excessively and would not permit himself to be comforted. His response was abnormal. He neglected himself and his responsibilities, and he had to be soundly rebuked by Joab before he would take steps to return to Jerusalem and save the kingdom. His troubles were not over, but the Lord would empower him to be the ruler that he wanted him to be. The Lord can heal a broken heart if we give all the pieces to him and obey him by faith. This brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 19, and we see in this chapter David's return and some renewed problems. The repeated theme in this chapter is bringing back the king, verses 10, 11, 12, 15, and 41. David was across the Jordan in Mahanaim, but he belonged in Jerusalem. All the tribes, including David's own tribe of Judah, had participated in Absalom's rebellion to some extent. Now it was time for them to bring their king back to Jerusalem. Years of intrigue and intertribal conflict left Israel a deeply divided nation, and there was a desperate need for a strong display of unity and loyalty. This chapter describes 5 steps that David took to bring about the healing of the nation. The first step that David took was that he focused his perspective. In verses 1 through 8. Well, as Andrew Bonar has said, let us be as watchful after the victory as before the battle. It's possible to win the battle but lose the victory, which is what happened to David after Joab defeated Absalom and his army. What should have been a day of celebration for David's army at Mahanaim became a confused time of embarrassment and shame as the people stole back into the city as if they had been humiliated by defeat. They had risked their lives for king and country, and they were now treated like criminals. It was very unlike David to be insensitive to the sacrifices that his men made as they served him. But that day he was so obsessed with the death of Absalom that he could think of nothing else. By isolating himself from his men, the king turned a military victory into an emotional defeat. David was not only a great warrior, but also a deeply emotional poet and musician, and a man who could go from the depths of despair into the heights of glory while writing one psalm. David had experienced a difficult time after the death of Amnon, and the death of his favorite son Absalom left him devastated. David's attitude puzzled his followers. They saw Absalom as a liar, a murderer, a traitor, and a rebel. Well, certainly we expect a father to grieve over the tragic death of a son and overlook the son's mistakes and sins. But leaders must still lead, even if their hearts are broken. That's one of the prices that leaders must pay. On October 10, 1950, Sir Winston Churchill was introduced at the University of Copenhagen as the architect of victory. Churchill replied, "I was only the servant of my country, and had I at any moment failed to express her unflinching resolve to fight and conquer, I should at once have been rightly cast aside." Well, David the father forgot that he was also David the king, and that he still had his crown because his brave soldiers put the good of the nation ahead of their own personal interest. Joab's short but cutting speech jolted the king back to reality, and David took his place at the gate, where his men came to him and where he acknowledged their brave service. It's likely that David didn't yet know that it was Joab who engineered Absalom's death and burial. Otherwise, his response might have been different. It didn't take long for David to find out what Joab and his men did, and this helped to precipitate David's naming Amasa as general of the army. The one thing that's missing in the entire Absalom episode is David seeking the mind of the Lord as he made decisions. The younger David called for the Urim and the Thummim, or he asked for the counsel of a prophet. But apart from his prayer in chapter 15 and verse 31, we don't find David requesting guidance from God. Of course, the wilderness psalms record his concerns and his prayers, so we know he wasn't depending on himself and his leaders alone. But we wish David had sought God's direction as he dealt with Absalom and the problems he created. When it came to dealing with his sons, David needed all the help he could get, but perhaps he wouldn't admit it. It's never too late for God to work. Well, the second thing that David does to unite the nation is, in fact, that he strives for unity in verses 9 through 15 of 2 Samuel 19. When David finally arrived in Jerusalem, it was a signal to the nation that the rebellion was ended and their true king was back on the throne. But en route to Jerusalem, David made some decisions that sent out other important messages to the people. His first message was that he wanted his kingdom to be a united people. The old prejudices and animosities must be buried, and the nation must be united behind its king. Within the tribes, the people were divided between the followers of Absalom and the followers of David, and the old division between the 10 tribes and Judah still persisted. Well, David began his seeking after unity with the tribe of Judah. In verses 11 and 12, the leaders from all 12 tribes should have united in sending a formal invitation to David to return and reign, but party squabbles and tribal hostility kept things confused. David knew that the trouble would only increase if he waited too long to regain his city and his throne, so he marched right ahead. After all, he was God's anointed king, and he didn't need to call for a referendum before taking back his throne. Well, Judah was the tribe from which the king was supposed to come, Genesis 49 and verse 10. David was from the tribe of Judah. His capital city was in Judah. And the elders of Judah had first made him king back in chapter 2. So he logically turned first to the elders of Judah for help. Using his two priests as intermediaries, David told the elders of Judah that the Israelites and the other tribes were talking about returning the king to Jerusalem, but he had heard nothing from his own tribe. Absalom had begun his rebellion in Hebron, which was in Judah, and the leaders of Judah must have cooperated with him at least to some extent. So it was time that they displayed their allegiance to David, their rightful king. It's likely that all the tribal leaders who had foolishly followed Absalom were wondering what David would do to them once he regained his throne. Well, we see in verses 13 and 14 that David appointed Amasa to be his general. The news of this appointment must have shocked the leaders of the nation and then brought them great relief, for it meant that David was pardoning all the officials who had followed Absalom, because Amasa had been Absalom's general, whose assignment it was to search for David and destroy him. But now David was making his nephew, and Joab's cousin, the leader of his great army. But why replace Joab? Well, for one thing, David learned, evidently, that it was Joab who had killed Absalom in disobedience to his orders. Even though he deserved death, Absalom could have been taken alive and brought to David to be dealt with later. And Joab didn't have the authority to defy his king and act as judge and executioner. If Joab did this to the king's son, what might he do to the king himself? This brings up a second reason that David replaced Joab. Joab had been gradually increasing his authority ever since David had been told to stop waging war personally, as we will see in chapter 21. In the ancient East, the king was commander-in-chief of the army, and whoever took his place, for whatever reason, became a man of high esteem and authority. It was Joab who told David to come to Rabbah for the final conquest. Otherwise, Joab would take the city and name it after himself. By the time of the battle of the forest of Ephraim, Joab had at least 10 armor bearers. Joab had a record of eliminating anybody who threatened his authority. He and his brother Abishai had killed Abner, who had been King Saul's general. And before the story ends, Joab will kill Amasa in chapter 20. Joab and his brothers, though capable warriors, caused much grief to David from early in his reign. Of course, Joab knew all about the murder of Uriah, and perhaps this piece of information carried more power than his sword. But when he killed Absalom, Joab went too far, and David saw this as an opportunity to get rid of his power-hungry general. Amasa had led the rebel army, so by appointing him to Joab's position, David united the army and declared an amnesty to all the rebel soldiers, giving the nation a new beginning. As the other tribes debated and delayed, the men of Judah united behind David with all their hearts, and they sent him an official invitation to return home. David went down to the Jordan near Gilgal, and the men of Judah met him there. The first place that Israel camped after Joshua had led them across the Jordan was Gilgal, and it was less than 20 miles from Jerusalem and a key city in Jewish history. It was there in Joshua chapters 3, 4, and 5 that the males of the new generation entered into covenant with Jehovah and were circumcised. And it was at Gilgal that Samuel renewed the covenant when Saul became king in 1 Samuel 11. Well, the text does not state it, but perhaps David also renewed the covenant at Gilgal and assured the people that Jehovah was still on the throne and his word was still in force. Perhaps it was a time of rededication for the king, for throughout the rest of the book, we see David very much in charge. Well, the third thing that David does to unite the nation is seen in 2 Samuel 19:16 through 23. And that is something we've already mentioned, and that is that he declares general amnesty. Not only were the men of Judah at the Jordan to welcome David, but his enemy Shimei the Benjamite was there with 1,000 men from his tribe. Ziba, the land manager for Mephibosheth, was also in the crowd with his 15 sons and 20 servants, and they crossed the river to meet him on the western shore and help escort him to the other side. Somebody must have provided a ferry boat that went back and forth across the Jordan to carry the king's household so they wouldn't have to ford the river. When David arrived on the western bank of the river, Shimei prostrated himself and begged for mercy. There's no doubt that Shimei deserved to be killed for the way he treated David, and Abishai was willing to do the job. But David stopped his nephew just as he had done before. The first time David stopped Abishai, his reason was that the Lord had told Shimei to curse the king, so David would take his abuse as from the hand of the Lord. But now his reason for sparing Shimei was because it was a day of rejoicing, not a day of revenge. But even more, by pardoning Shimei, King David was offering a general amnesty to all who had supported Absalom during the rebellion. David kept his word, and he didn't have Shimei killed for his crime. But when David was about to die, as we will see in 1 Kings 2, he warned Solomon to keep an eye on Shimei. Solomon put him on house arrest and told him not to leave Jerusalem. But when Shimei disobeyed the king, he was taken and killed. Shimei had a weakness for resisting authority and treating God's appointed ministers with disdain. And that's why David cautioned Solomon. Shimei did not appreciate David's mercy, nor Solomon's grace, and his independence and arrogance finally caught up with him. This brings us to chapter 19, verses 24 through 30, where the fourth thing that David does to unite the nation is to correct an error. Mephibosheth, the disabled prince, had been adopted into David's household and permitted to eat at the king's table back in chapter 9. This was a gift from David in honor of Jonathan, Mephibosheth's father, and David's beloved friend. When David became king of all Israel, he inherited everything that had belonged to Saul, including his land. And some of the land he turned over to Mephibosheth to help support him and his family. David commanded Saul's servant Ziba to care for the land and to obey Mephibosheth, which he promised to do. But as we saw, when David was escaping from Jerusalem, Ziba showed up without his master and brought help to David and his people. At the time, David made an impulsive decision and gave all the land to Ziba, chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Ziba also showed up to help David across the river and return home, back in verse 17 of this chapter. Well, Ziba wasn't on hand to help him, so it would have been difficult for Mephibosheth, again a crippled man, to travel the 20 miles or so from Jerusalem to the Jordan. But he did it. He knew that Ziba had slandered him by telling David that he hoped the rebellion would succeed and the crown be returned to the house of Saul. Mephibosheth wanted an opportunity to speak to David personally, to deny Ziba's lies, and to affirm his own allegiance to the king. The repeated address, "My Lord the King," came from his heart. He was loyal to the king. Well, as David listened to Mephibosheth's explanation, he realized that he had jumped to conclusions when he gave all the land to Ziba. But David didn't have time to conduct a hearing to settle the matter. Mephibosheth made it clear that he wasn't asking his king for anything. The king had given him life. For what more was there to desire? To paraphrase his speech, "I have more than I deserve, so why should I seek the throne? I was destined to die, and you not only saved me, but you took me into your own family circle. Well, David's response isn't easy to understand. On the surface, he seemed to be saying, there's no need to go into the matter again. You and Ziba divide the land. But was David the kind of man who went back on his word? How would that kind of decision be received by the 1,000 Benjamites who came to the Jordan to welcome David? After all, doing something kind to Mephibosheth would have strengthened David's ties with both the tribe of Benjamin and also the 10 tribes that had originally followed the house of Saul. Taking away half of Mephibosheth's inheritance hardly fit into the joyful and forgiving atmosphere of the day. And yet, by dividing the estate, David was also forgiving Ziba of his lies and treachery to his master. By dividing the land between Ziba and Mephibosheth, David was taking the easy way out. But Mephibosheth's reply must have stunned David, because in verse 30 he said, rather let him, that is Ziba, take it all, inasmuch as my lord the king has come back in peace to his own house. But thanks to David's impetuous judgment, Ziba already had it all. This situation reminds us of the case of the dead baby that Solomon had to solve in 1 Kings chapter 3. When he offered to divide the living child, the child's true mother protested, and that's how Solomon discovered her identity. Unlike a living baby, land isn't hard or is not harmed when it's divided. But perhaps David was testing Mephibosheth to see where his heart lay. The text doesn't tell us, but perhaps Mephibosheth did receive all the land as in the original contract. Either way, the crippled prince was cared for as Ziba worked the land. This brings us to 2 Samuel 19:31 through 40, where the fifth thing that David does is rewards the faithful in order to unite the kingdom again. Barzillai was one of 3 wealthy landowners who met David when he arrived at Mahanaim and together supplied his needs and the needs of his people. He returned to his home in Rogelim, 20 to 25 miles north. But when he heard that David was returning to Jerusalem, he came down to see him off. Unlike Shimei, he had no sins to confess, nor was there a misunderstanding to straighten out as with Mephibosheth. Barzillai wanted no favor from the king. All he wanted was to have the joy of sending him off safely, knowing that the war was over. These 2 trips must have been difficult for an 80-year-old man, but he wanted to give his best to his king. David wanted to reward Barzillai by caring for him at his palace in Jerusalem. Not only did David want to express his thanks, but by having so important a man in Jerusalem, it would strengthen ties with the citizens on the other side of the Jordan at a time when unity was important. But Barzillai graciously refused David's offer on the grounds that he was too old. Older people don't like to pull up their roots and relocate. They want to die at home and be buried with their loved ones. At his age, Barzillai couldn't enjoy the special pleasures of life at court, and he would only be a burden to the king, who had enough to think about. However, Barzillai was willing to let his son Chimham take his place and go to Jerusalem to live. What Barzillai didn't need for himself, he was willing for others to enjoy. Matthew Henry said this, "They that are old must not begrudge young people those delights which they themselves are past the enjoyment of, nor oblige them to retire as they do." Barzillai crossed the river with David and Chimham, with David and Chimham, and went a short distance with them. And then they said goodbye, David affectionately kissing his friend and supporter. In Jeremiah's time, in Jeremiah 41, there was a site known as Geruth Kimham, which means habitation of Chimham. and it was near Bethlehem, which may have been where Barzillai's son settled down with his family. But David's troubles were not over yet, for the long-running feud between the 10 tribes and Judah would surface again and almost cause another civil war. Shakespeare was right when he said, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown." Well, this brings us to the end of an hour and a good place to stop. We'll pick up in session 23 with 2 Samuel 19 and verse 41, where we will see David's new struggles. As always, if you ever have any questions, any concerns about the class or anything I've said in these lectures, I want you to feel free to contact me. I'm here to help, and I want you to succeed in all that you do. Thank you.